Like a lot of teenagers, my daughter really does not love getting up in the morning. Instead, she loves her cozy bed and the sweet dark of her room. Many days, she can barely be persuaded that anything would be better than just staying there and sleeping. Now, this can lead to a lot of frustrating exchanges and more than a few tense words exchanged, but sometimes when I'm in a more patient place, I can step back and laugh at how 17 years ago I would have given anything for her to sleep like this. See, for most of her first year, Gracie would wake up 3 or 4 times in the night, usually soaked through her diaper and hungry. Like most first-time parents, we both knew this could happen, and also we had no idea how it would actually feel to go weeks and months in a row with no more than 3 hours of sleep in a row. I'm confident that I lost a portion of my brain functioning that I will definitely never get back. Now, since we could not breastfeed, there was no turning over and feeding intermittently, off and on in a kind of sleepy haze that I've heard about. Night feeding for us instead meant trekking down the curvy stairs to the kitchen, where we would carefully make a bottle and then go back up those stairs, feed her, and then eventually go back to sleep, only to be woken up for a repeat a couple hours later. Over and over again for months, until one day Carrie had a brilliant idea where she realized we could pre-make the bottles and avoid the up and down the stairs, not to mention the trying to make the bottles while half asleep, which, let's be honest, often resulted in spoonfuls of formula on the counter. It felt like a really good solution, except one thing. Pre-made bottles can't just sit out all night. So we made a special trip to Babies R Us and found a special cooler made just for bottles that we could keep in our room. We felt so proud of this solution. The only wrinkle in our plan was that Gracie would have to drink cold bottles. It wasn't technically bad for her, but let's just say she did not exactly make a happy face when she'd take those first few gulps. But those extra few minutes of sleep in the night was just everything to us. And so with only a tiny bit of guilt, we decided it was fine. She's fine. So fast forward 2 years later when our second child, Joseph, arrived. From the start, Joseph was a much better sleeper, but he'd still wake in the night for food and changing like babies do. So we pulled out that little cooler and returned to our routine until one morning, Carrie looked at me and said, "Hey, why don't we just get the water all ready and get the bottles ready with the right amount of formula in them and then put them by our bed and then not mix them until he needs one in the night. That way they don't have to be cold, but also we don't have to go all the way to the kitchen." When she said this, we both had a pause and then we burst out laughing and also immediately felt so bad for Gracie and all those sad faces she'd made with the cold bottles. The solution had been there right in front of us the whole time. But as first-time moms doing so many things for the first time, and we'd been overwhelmed and anxious and tired, anxious not just because of regular stuff of being new moms, but also because of the high risk of the foster care process, foster adoptive process we were in. And did I mention that we were really tired? We were just clumsy and disoriented so much of the time, which meant we simply could not see that what we needed was right there. And instead we came up with other solutions that created other problems, and poor Gracie had to endure all those cold bottles. Has this ever happened to you? You know, where the thing you need is actually just right there in front of you, but it might as well be on another planet, especially when you're tired or anxious or you're doing something you've never done before. Things are just hard and overwhelming and a struggle until suddenly something happens and it's just like, you just wake up. And the thing that you've been needing is just there. And then instead of feeling that life is impossible and overwhelming without anything really changing, it feels instead suddenly easy. And like you have everything that you need or want. Or really, without anything changing outside of you. Because what happens is that something really significant does change inside you. Something breaks loose in your heart or in your mind, in your body, where there was once struggle there and chaos, there is ease and breath And where there was judgment, there is instead joy. And right where you had been rigid and annoyed, you instead start to laugh with delight. It is an experience of awakening to what is already true, as if seeing with new eyes, or as if the world, the realer world, just comes into focus. When it happens, it feels like magic, and in a certain way, it kind of is, because there is not a precise formula for it to get the switch to flip. Something happens in you that is both about you, but also is profoundly not about you. It reminds me of how I've come to think about addiction and recovery, which is that there's an element of getting sober that it requires making choices. That is everyday choices that will create the possibility for wellness, both in the individual and also people around the individual making choices that include new patterns of behaviors and boundaries, choices built on a commitment to change, and choices that create new opportunities for connection. But also there is an element of recovery that is beyond choice. It is instead about an intervention of grace that releases the grip of addiction and makes sobriety possible. And this happens not just in addiction, but in all sorts of ways when we get caught in a cycle of pain and struggle that is until in a flash or maybe in a slow, meticulous crawl, we come instead to know healing and freedom and joy. All a result of both the choices that we're making and also something beyond our own choices. I call it grace because it doesn't matter whether you deserve that awakening or not. And it doesn't matter whether you've tried hard enough or if you want it enough. Grace is the force that comes as a gift, the force that softens your heart or flips the switch or opens your eyes and ears and minds to something that was already and always true, where you realize that everything you need is here, in you, among us, and has been all along. Now, with all that said, I don't mean to invoke the sort of theology that says all we have to do is think differently and life will be beautiful. You know, the sort of theology that was popularized in The Secret a few years back, or by Tony Robbins, or even by Deepak Chopra, all of which have this version of the idea that by simply reframing our mindset, we will have everything that we need, or that we can power of positive thinking our way to the good life. These are dangerous theologies, actually, that don't hold up to any of the atrocities of human existence, like slavery or famine or abuse, let alone physical or mental illness. These tangible realities are not erased by thinking differently. What I mean instead is to say that there's something also always and persistently true, alongside and intertwined with these great losses and atrocities, that is the presence of persistent and unconditional goodness and abundance, universally available and unconditional. Some might conceive of this goodness and abundance as God, but you don't have to. One explicitly Unitarian way of conceiving of it comes from the Transcendentalists. That's the 19th century movement in our history that focused on the capacity of individuals to discern ultimate truth through their own experience and the goodness of human nature and all nature. One of the leaders of the Transcendentalist movement, Ralph Waldo Emerson, described the persistent presence of unconditional goodness as the oversoul. I want to read now a longish quote from his 1841 essay called The Oversoul, because I want us to hear this theology that is our own tradition, that we can work with, and also because it gives us a really good way to understand and conceive of this goodness that is always and everywhere available. Okay, so Emerson writes, "The great nature in which we rest, as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere, that unity, the oversoul, within which every person's particular being is contained and made one with all other, that common heart of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission, that overpowering reality which confutes our tricks and talents and constrains everyone to pass for what they are, and to speak from their character and not from their tongue, and which evermore tends to pass into our thought and hand and become wisdom and virtue and power and beauty. We live in succession, in division, in parts and particles. Meantime, within humanity is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. And this deep power in which we exist and whose beatitude is all accessible to us is not only self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the thing seen, the seer and the spectacle, the subject and the object are one. We see the world piece by piece as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree, but the whole, of which these things are the shining parts, is the soul. That we can wake up and experience a sense of this reality, this awareness that everything we need is here, that it can even for a moment wash over us with delight and wonder and joy without anything changing all that much outside of us, is a reminder that we can live with a faith in this truth all the time. So that when we feel we are falling short, or when we feel the world is falling short, which happens all the time, in small, everyday ways and also in devastating, destructive ways, we can remember that in this same place where there is struggle, there is also the presence of this great oneness and universal beauty. A presence that offers us companionship in this struggle, a promise that we are never alone, that we are seen and known and loved, and also a presence that offers us partnership and support to carry us through, and assurance that something else is possible. As the prophet Isaiah said, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Do you not yet perceive it?" To live with this awareness, even when we are not perceiving it, is an orientation of the heart. It is an act of faith. And this faith is one of the choices that makes our experience of this goodness more possible, that we might in turn become its partner and co-conspirator, furthering its reach and its forces in our lives and in the world. Elia Kemmler wrote her story about the church where everything goes wrong just a couple months after she started a new ministry, which is not the case for me. I've been serving Foothills for a decade as of this summer, but there was a moment right around that 10-year mark where I couldn't stop thinking about her reflection and that feeling she describes so well, where she wants everything to be holy and lovely and perfect, and instead it's difficult and loud and a struggle. Especially coming out of the pandemic, sometimes I felt like we have a kind of amnesia about where we kind of forget how to do this thing we've actually done every Sunday for over a century. But then I remember that sometimes amnesia is about trauma. And I remember we've been through something that matters, and we are still trying to make sense of. And I remember that this process, this recovery, is happening not just in church, but in all sorts of places in our lives, like schools and workplaces and in spaces for volunteering and in activism. Things where that we remember as being easy feel instead difficult and complex. Kind of like when Carrie and I were first-time parents, there's this collective anxiety and exhaustion among people these days that make even the most obvious things feel obscure and out of reach. So it was this Sunday where my friend and colleague, the Reverend Kelly Dignan, was here to lead the service. We were preparing for our first membership ceremony in 3 years. She'd arrived early and we were talking through the order of service with staff and volunteers, and it was just taking forever. One issue after another came up, and finally, ready or not, it was just time to start. I leaned over to Kelly and asked, "Do you remember church being this hard?" And she just laughed and said, "I really don't." The service proceeded on, and before long, it was time for that membership ceremony. And at that point, Elaine invited everyone who had recently joined Foothills or who was ready that day to join, and to all of them to come forward. And at that moment, about a third of the gathering got out of their chairs and rushed the stage. I later called it our Unitarian altar call. It was chaotic. And it was confusing, and it took about 10 minutes longer than we thought it would. But in that moment, something broke open in me. Instead of being annoyed and overwhelmed at the mess of it all, I was overcome with how beautiful it all is. That after everything, we're still seeking community and relationship and meaning, and these impulses are not tidy. They overflow because this goodness is abundant and resilient and everywhere. Coming back to church after all these last few years, in many ways, we are all new here, all doing this for the first time, because this moment is new and we're all learning over again who we are and how to do all of this together and why. How to have a church that's both in the sanctuary and also in so many other places, like here with you. What it means to have a faith that is uncontained and everywhere. In the place of our greatest struggle resides also the source of beauty. Here we are met in partnership with the presence of love that abides. And that reminds us over and over again, we are not just enough. We are together more than enough, already and always. May it be so, and amen.